Ken,
Hey,
we
Clint.
are we are back yet again with another Ziti TV, March 25th, which is exciting. Um, we're starting a new thing where we try to have a tiny agenda. So here's my tiny agenda. Um, I started last week going over the change logs, and that was a relatively big change log. Ziti being an open source project, we oftentimes will have multiple releases in a week. Apparently, we are busy making bigger than small features because we had no releases this week, so there was no changes to review, which is
Okay.
cool. There's a fella out in discourse. I assume it's a fella, it might be a lady, but there's a person out in discourse who's been contributing a lot of comments and questions, which is exciting and awesome. So
It
shout
is.
out to Mark of Mind if you're watching.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that they had brought up was, it'd be really nice if we could go over router or controller and router configurations and what each of those things is about and how that works. And that's going to dovetail into firewall requirements because they had also noticed from the NetFoundry side of things, the sponsor of the OpenZiti project, the pay for SaaS application, that the NetFoundry documentation has a nice, here are the firewall ports that you have to open in order
Right.
to implement an OpenZiti, or a NetFoundry network
Right.
in
And
that
it's easy to
case.
document because we chose defaults. These are the ones that we're using. But if you're
Yeah.
writing the configuration, then you got to make sure they line up.
That's right. And so we'll get into all that. In fact, thanks for saying that because that'll dovetail. I had forgotten that the OpenZiti landing page does have a host it myself anywhere. So we'll go into that as well. All right. So that's what we're going to do. Free flowing as always. My expectation is that we're going to, let's do the old maximize on this thing. Pew! And I'll make this a little bit bigger. So here I have a checkout of the OpenZiti project, and I'm in the quick start folder and in a folder inside of there called Docker. And this is just the place where I chose to put our Docker files. So if you do a listing in here, what branch am I on? Git status. Release next. Okay, great. So if you look in here, you'll see there's a couple different Docker Compose files. I added these shell scripts not too long ago just because I needed them, which is almost always how anything in the quick start folder gets there.
Right.
And I added this terribly named push latest Docker, which doesn't actually, sorry, not that one, the push development Docker, that push dev build, which doesn't actually push to Docker Hub at all. So terribly misnamed. I'm going to misname that as well. But you'll see a bunch of files in here. One of them that we're going to focus on is where's Docker Compose? This guy, this file right here. So I'm going to simply turn on my Docker Compose up. Now I
Right.
use
So you're running the Docker quick start so to give you a local ZT stack, and you're doing this so that we can take a look at the configuration for router or controller or both.
It's exactly what we're doing, Ken. You're so
Okay.
smart. You knew right where I was heading here.
Well, I
You can
just got to slow
you
you
can
down a
see,
minute, make sure I can follow along.
yeah. You can see I run Windows, and running Docker inside of Windows. You'll have to figure out how to do that. This isn't about Docker, but you're exactly right. The whole reason I'm going to turn on Docker is for no other reason than to get access to a whole bunch of config files, and then
So they
apparently
didn't exist
crash
before you
Windows.
ran Compose up? I know
Um,
Compose is great for storing like a Docker run config, like your environment variables, your volumes, and stuff like that. But does it actually generate the configs as well?
It's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. Really good question. Let's go over here and make this window bigger now because this is also in that Docker folder. And if I look at the Docker Compose file, you'll see that each of these guys, let's go back up to the important bits. Each of these does not follow the expectations of a Docker environment, meaning there are two different binaries in this one image. And I did that specifically just to make it easier on me so I could fire up either a router or a controller whenever I wanted to.
Oh,
You
I
can
got you.
see you can see what the command that's being run here, depending on what kind of thing you're trying to add, is it runs a script, and that script then has a parameter that tells you what kind of thing it is. So if I go all the way to the top here, you'll see my edge router. I run router and I say run edge router. And that's
Mhm.
what's going to create the edge router. And then I do some things like I can run controller as well. Now, your question, where were those config files? Because if I look at image and I VI run controller, you'll see one of the things that this thing does is it generates an environment file.
This is the shell script that's invoked when you bring the container up.
When you run Docker Compose, it will bring all your containers up, and one of those containers will be a controller, and that controller will be started using this script. And so
Okay.
you'll see we'll do a few things. I set the name of the controller and the name of the edge controller because the controller and the edge controller, same but kind of different. So edge controller is what I always think about. Controller is more about the fabric. So when I think of when I don't use the word edge, which is an Express component, when I use the word controller, I think uh, primarily fabric. But when I'm talking about a holistic solution, I think edge
Okay.
controllers. So
So
that's why
in my own words, we're configuring two different pieces of the controller. These are like two different APIs. The controller
right.
needs to talk to everything. It's in the center of the universe. So
That's
the
right.
Ziti controller is like the fabric API, and Edge controller is the Edge API, which
Yeah,
talks. They're
and
like
you would
on two
say
sides of the same fence.
that's right. And you would say that the controller was extensible. And because it was extensible, we extended it and we implemented the edge on top of the controller. Now, they're both the same runtime, right? So like you're not starting two different runtimes, it's just one runtime,
Yeah, it's the
but
same process.
it is an edge controller that's starting up. And this also is subject to change. I know we are coming along with distributed controllers.
Oh yeah.
So we might be getting rid of controllers in the future. I don't really know. It depends on how, Paul and the Fabric people end up implementing it. But so here you'll see generate M file after I sourced the ZDCLI function script, which is the helper script anybody who's run any of the quick starts is probably familiar with. And this will go out and create an M file, and it will do it at
Mhm.
ZD home.
Inside the
Now,
container.
that's right. And because it's inside the container, because it's inside the Docker runtime, and because I'm able to do things like specify which networks are which, I can
Mhm.
do I can make decisions inside of this container that may or may not be viable for everybody, right? So let me just bring this onto the screen because this is what the Docker Compose container brings up. And
Okay.
so
3 Docker networks.
3 Docker networks, 1 edge router that's regular, quote unquote, 1 WebSocket 1, which I'm not going to talk about, 2 private edge routers, and 1 fabric router or transit router or just plain old router, however you want to term it, and a controller. And so
Okay.
that's what ends up getting brought up. But all of these things, because it's all in my Docker container, because it's all in my Docker Compose, because I can take these liberties, one of the things the file will do um, is it will expect that there is a volume. And
Can we look
so,
at that image one more time
oh sure,
real quick? I
maybe
just wanna make sure I understand this correctly. So, you've got routers and controllers, which are the actual executable, that's the app. 2 different applications, and then the differences here, which network they're in, and whether it's a fabric router or WebSocket or whatever, those are just configuration and identity that make
that's right.
those different, but it's 2
There are
pieces of software.
two
Okay,
binaries at play:
okay,
ZD router and ZD controller.
got it.
So green circle, ZD router, ZD router, ZD router, ZD
Yep,
router, ZD router, ZD
and the only
controller.
difference is configuration.
That's right. And then we'll see that configuration, which is exactly what we're doing. Yeah,
Alright.
perfect. So I was talking about this volume map because it's really important when you bring up well, I'm gonna have to do WSL distribution Ubuntu 20. Come on,
You're telling Windows
120.04.
to run a certain VM, right?
No, I'm running, so I run Windows subsystem for Linux. And so in order to get into the same VM, same Windows subsystem. I have to tell it which variant I want.
I'm with you.
Otherwise, I can't run Docker PS, and I can't run Docker Network LS. So you can see I have the networks: the Docker ZD Blue, Docker ZD Red,
Oh, yeah.
my first network, and also
You even give them friendly names.
Docker Volume LS. This is what I wanted to do. So you see, when you up that compose file, you'll get a volume. This volume is important, and I promise it's all coming back right here. Here's the payoff, all that
Okay.
backstory.
Yeah, I see
And,
ZDFS right there from the
right.
compose file.
And so what happens is when this Docker container executes, when the controller executes, at the very beginning, you'll see all of the routers. They sit there and they say, "Hey, I'm gonna just sit here and I'm gonna wait for where is it? Doot, doot, doot,
No, that's
doot,
just
doot."
storage for one container. You're not using the volume for
No,
inter-container
no.
communication
That's
or
where we're
stuff.
going. Yep,
Right.
that's where we're going. So when these routers come online, we can't really see them in here. They will wait for the controller to start. And the
Mhm.
reason why they wait for the controller to start is because a lot of that environment is reused amongst the other containers. So I was coming down here
Oh,
because I was
okay.
going to Docker exec. So if I'm going to Docker exec,
Just a little
let's get
shortcut
let's
to
get the TV
share the
off.
environment.
How do I turn off the old TV? Boom, there it goes. Docker exec, come back over here now. Docker exec, interactive into Docker ZD controller, and we're going to run bash. All right, so when we come into this container, and I do this a lot, particularly in my demos, because I can then do things like ZD login, right? And I think I've shown things in the past like ZD fabric list links, which shows you all of the links that there are, for ZD at that time.
This is the
Um,
controller container?
I exec into the controller, although it
Okay.
doesn't really matter because if I type LL, you'll see all of the files that were generated. So the fabric routers here, the private blue router, the private red router, all
This is
the
on the
config
volume.
files, they're all on the volume.
Okay.
That actually has some nice side effects because when you stop a compose file, if you don't do a -v, it doesn't delete the volume, and so when you bring it all back up again, all your state will still be there, which is
Right.
helpful, really helpful. Anyway, when that controller starts up, it will emit the ZD environment variable or a file. This is part of what happens. And then
Gotcha.
each of those routers is going to then source that environment variable or that
From
environment
the
file
volume.
to get environment variables that are necessary. Most of them
Okay.
aren't used. Most of them aren't used, but
Right.
some of them
But each
are.
one knows what to look for itself, and this takes the place of in a real world deployment, you would need to orchestrate like doing some stuff on the controller and then shuttling those bytes over to the router so you could do the registration over there. This just gives you like a little wormhole between them so that you don't have to do that.
Well, no. In fact, yes and no. Realistically, all I am using the shared file system for is this one environment variable.
Okay.
And all the environment variable does is assist me in making the configurations.
Right.
Because the one thing that and I could have, I suppose I could have hard coded it because, again, going back to it's our Docker environment, we can control it.
Right.
I probably could just make some assumptions. Let's look at maybe controller file. What do you think?
Okay.
So if I do psef
It's
pipe
YAML,
script
right?
for Ziti, yeah. So if I show the processes that are running, you'll see which one is running and which config file it's used.
Oh yeah.
So I can then open that file up and inside. Let me make it maybe a little bit bigger. Yeah, I'll just hide those other two windows. So inside of here, oh, I've apparently been here before. Let's go to the top. We're at the top, yeah. So V3, that's the version of the file. Generally doesn't change, but you can see we're on 3. And I'm just going to keep coming down. Trace and profile, these are debugging stuff that I would say are not not well documented from my memory. They might be documented somewhere in the ZD repo itself, but generally speaking, I haven't done a whole lot with this myself.
Oh, I
I
see. They're
know
commented out at
yeah,
the top.
they are commented out. Yeah, and I know some of the developers of the ZD project when they are having to debug a problem,
Yeah,
they might need these
that's
sorts
what
of
it looks
things.
like, is just troubleshooting.
It's exactly,
capabilities.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I haven't played too much with that. Then we
So it
have the
needs to store
database.
its stuff in a file, a database file.
Yep. And so now we have a database, and this is a Babolt store. So when the controller comes online, it will initialize this database. In fact, the script itself will call, you'll see
Right.
ZD controller init, and that's what makes this database.
Is that like a critical asset, or is it ephemeral,
No, it's
performance boosting
totally,
kind of cache?
it is everything that represents your controller and your network's configuration.
Oh, gotcha.
It
So
is
you need to
absolutely
process the config file, the identity, and the databate after you've bootstrapped everything.
process the config file and the database. Well, and when you bootstrap, the database gets created, but
Oh, that is the
um,
identity.
yeah. So what I was talking about before about the volume and it not disappearing, if you down your compose file, that database stays there. So when you bring it back up, you have all your state again.
Oh, okay.
That's what's cool. With the if you were to go and look at the Docker no compose quick start, you'll see I start each container in their own shell. Like that's what I like to do, and that's how I do it. I don't run it as a daemon, and I do that. And I also pass the minus minus rm flag, which
Mhm.
means to Docker when this thing is
Switching it.
done, let's delete it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, I don't want to do that. And people who use Docker will probably know better, and you'll learn that lesson the first time when you turn it off and on, and all of a sudden it's broken.
Yeah.
But so that's the database, and then you'll see this next block. This is where the PKI comes in, and this is, in my opinion, by far the most complex part of setting up an OpenZiti network is understanding the PKI and how it goes together and how it's important. So I'm gonna probably bounce down for a second after this, but we can look at it. There are four basic pieces to the PKI. The most vital is probably the key. This is the piece of material that you cannot do anything without. It's
Mhm.
what is creates a certificate. Well, it's important for a certificate to be created, and it's the piece of the cryptographic material that allows you to actually encrypt and decrypt whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's
So
backing up. That's like the identity behind everything.
it is everything. Yeah. And then after that, you'll see there are two certs. So if we were to bring up, I had a different, is it, maybe I'll just use Visio. Fine. I'll just use Visio. I know where this is. I've got this on the overview page, so I can bring it up like this. Yes, I can open this
Oh,
in a
I
new
see. You've
tab.
got two certs depending on which side of the handshake you're on.
Which side of the handshake? That's right.
Right. The
Yeah,
TLS handshake. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, in fact, as you'll recall, as you just did, every piece of a ZD overlay network requires mutual TLS. So if we're looking at just the controller and just one client and anything that participates on the overlay network is going to be at this time it's going to be an edge client. So this SDK is really an edge SDK. Your ZD Desktop Edge for Windows, like the one that I run, that is an implementation of the Golang SDK. So it is an SDK based application, even though it provides functionality that is not necessarily app embedded. It provides that tunneling capabilities. But the cert here is whatever the is the certificate which the controller will present when communicating to other entities. The server chain is the certificate which is presented from other entities when they try to connect to the controller. And now, since I'm running Docker and because I have exposed and we'll get into firewalls and maybe even Docker in a second because this is relevant. Um, but on my local host port 1280, I'm going to bring this window over. On my local host port 1280, you see it's listening and it says select a certificate. So the controller right now is asking me, my browser, please supply a certificate so I can authenticate you. Now, in this case, because I'm going to the root URL, I don't have to, and I can just click cancel. So I'll click cancel. And when I do that, you'll see I've come to the controller, and now I am in, or I've accessed that controller. This is the one running in Docker. You can see Docker thinks it's running inside of Ziti minus edge minus controller. That's the name of that Docker network. And that's the one that Ziti wants you to use to connect to it. Now, if you're doing this at home and you're trying to do the same thing, and you try to go to 1280.ziti or Ziti controller to 1280, it might not work for you. And you'll wonder why did it work for Clint and it didn't work for me? And it's because I have already gone out of my way to add a hosts entry for my Ziti Edge controller and my Ziti Edge router, as well as my Ubuntu machine, but
Oh,
whatever.
so your system is seeing a match between the name and the certificate? Or is it just that you're
My,
able to get to it?
my system is able to resolve the name Ziti Edge controller. If I didn't
Okay,
have this in here, then I wouldn't be able to resolve Ziti Edge controller.
You
And so my
hacked your DNS.
browser, what was that?
You
Oh,
hacked your
hacked my,
DNS.
in a way, yeah. A hosts file I wouldn't call hacking DNS, but yeah, same sort of thing. So that makes it resolvable to me, and that's important because if you then do something like use your outside of Docker ZD Desktop Edge for Windows, and you try to add an identity, the identity needs to be able to get to the controller. Like that is the first thing. Every authorized before connect, you have to be able to get to the controller to establish a session, and that starts everything off. All right, so lots to talk about that. Anyway, that's what this section is. The CA section is interesting because that is the trust root for what your connections will be, what you will validate connections against. Now, where this is interesting is in the same exact file, you'll find what seems to be a totally duplicated set of, I'm sure they're in here. Where are they? Further down, right there. A totally duplicated set of entries. Looks identical. You'll notice one small difference is these in the Docker Compose file will have the word edge in them. These up here do not have the word edge in them. So they're
Okay.
technically two different certificates. So setting up this PKI, absolutely complicated. Very first time you try to do it. If you follow the quick start,
Question for
if
you,
you,
Quentin.
yeah.
Do all the certs come from the same CA that's built in?
So all of the certs are actually created when you bring up Docker Compose for the very first time. And there are multiple CAs that are involved, and I don't have enough back. That's a bummer. I can't go far enough back, but there are multiple CAs involved. In this case, there's a CA for the controller, and there's a CA for the edge, and there's also the other piece of this puzzle that we didn't, we kind of glossed over as we traversed here, is the signing certificate. So it is also a certificate authority. This is also created from a whole different chain. So it's not important that they all come from the same CA. You do not need them all to have the same root CA.
Okay.
You can do that. And if you look at the way the developer stuff is set up right now, if you go and look at the config files, that's exactly how it's done in, like, the regular people who are doing development, not me, because I use this, but some people just make one PKI, very simple PKI. All of it comes from the same trust root. The signing certificate is off the same root. There are no intermediaries. There's no extra intermediate. It's a very simple PKI. I went out of my way in this so that people who wanted a complex PKI would have um, a, a template to draw from, and they could go back and see how each of these things were created, where they were created, how they got created, when they got created, that sort of stuff. Oh, this is also important because the PKI is necessary for authenticating the Ziti CLI tool. And so that's another important thing that I use the shared storage for.
I'm not sure if I understand what the benefit of a more complex PKI is. Is that an easy thing to answer?
I'm not surprised. Most people I talk to go, "Why? Why?" The only answer is, "We support it, and thus I wanna test it, and I want it to make sure it works."
Yeah, that makes
You
sense.
you would be shocked at how easy it is to not know that a piece of code works for the wrong reason because it's because you
Oh,
reused
yeah,
the
yeah.
same CA.
Well, I get
So
that, but I mean, why do we support it? Like, is
that's
it like
well,
is it
it's because
is it
of the whole Express versus not Express, the controller versus the edge controller. You can have a entirely different PKI for your network nodes, the fabric,
right?
as opposed to your SD, your edge nodes. So the overlay itself versus the fabric
Interesting.
itself.
Okay,
So you
so
can
there's
have a whole
literally
different PKI for both.
fabric CA, an edge CA, and a signing CA, and they
Yes,
can be the same, but they don't have to be.
that's
So
exactly
when
right.
you say complex PKI, you just mean three different CAs
Yep,
with intermediate issuers in
yep,
there. Three different routes, three different intermediates, right?
that's right. Yep.
Okay.
And you don't have to do it that way. Like I said, I just did it that
Yeah.
way in case anybody wanted to or had to.
Okay.
All right. So then we're into the controller section up here under the mouse. Endpoint that the routers will connect to. You can see there are some options. They are commented out because I think we believe strongly that we should have sensible defaults that work for almost everybody, with the ability to tune the knobs if necessary. And then every time we add a new knob that you can tune, we should be adding an entry into these template files, and I
That
believe we
makes
do that.
sense.
So, listener, this is the IP address and the port that the controller will come up and listen on. And I didn't say edge controller, I said controller. So that means when something wants to connect to the management channel of the controller, they'll connect to this particular port. And this is where routers will connect. So when a router comes online, it will connect to port 6262. That's what it will be trying to connect
That's
to.
the Fabric API for routers.
Yeah, you can think of it like that. I mean, I think of it as the management plane, and
But there's
it's
another one right below it that says management.
there is another one right below it that says management. You're right. And that one, if I'm pretty sure that's a good question. One is the controller, one is the management plane. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I had that backwards.
Well, we did
Uh,
I know
oh
there's
no, no.
the
I think that it was so we had I see there this little bit, the endpoint that the management tools connect over.
that's the
I
management API.
Yeah, yeah, and that's been moved to REST. That's where I'm getting confused. So that used to be, I think, gRPC and not REST, and now there are REST endpoints for the management API.
Okay.
So that's what that is. That makes sense. And I like the management stuff. I never tend to use myself. Um,
For my benefit, are these port numbers by any chance? Do they just happen to be the same as the ones that NetFoundry uses for hosted OpenZiti, or are these just
I
arbitrary
th-
ports?
does NetFoundry use 6262?
Yeah,
Does it? I didn't think it
I
did.
think
Then
so.
I would
So there's
say
no assumption then. We shouldn't assume that these
no,
are the same ports.
no,
These are
no. In
just
fact,
developed.
I thought that it was port 80 and 443 that were used in the NetFoundry console stuff. We can get into firewall. This is more a
Okay, yeah.
firewall kind of question, but um, it does not matter what the ports are. Obviously, they're chosen to be greater than port 1024 in case you don't want to run it as root. And then the port 10,001, I don't know for sure, but I would expect that's probably going to go away at some point in favor of the REST endpoint, which I'll get to in a second.
Okay.
Metrics are neat. If you want to be able to write any interesting metrics to a local file and then have something like FileBeat pick it up and ship it somewhere, or if you want to have a different kind of metric reporter, this would be that section out
Can
of the gate.
Prometheus ingest the InfluxDB form, or does it have a form that
So
can?
Prometheus, as you know, is on my list of things. I don't know. I thought that the metrics reporter, which we used inside of the controller, had the capability already of exposing a Prometheus endpoint. I
Okay,
don't know that because I've never gotten far enough yet. It's on my list of things to look into.
totally.
But I want to Zetify that if so. uh, I don't know what XCTL example is. Health checks. So these are probably obvious. You know, it's just trying to make sure that Bolt is up and running.
Is that
You
a
can
separate
add.
service that needs to run in parallel with the controller?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know where health checks are. This is not something I'm strong on. Do you happen to know that one?
I think Bolt is just a format for the database file, and that the implementation, like the client and everything, there's no server. It's just kind of like SQLite, SQLite,
Oh,
where
no,
they're
no, no.
formatting
I
the
just
file.
I don't know how to configure the health check. Like, I would have to ask Paul that particular question. It's
No, I don't know how
one
to configure it.
it's one that I haven't had to do particularly, so it's like more of an enterprise feature that,
Yeah.
the other fellow, Mike Guthrie, might know way more about than I do. Um, but that's what that config section is.
Okay.
Uh, Edge, this is where we get into that Edge stuff that we were talking about, where a controller is also an Edge controller. And the important bits here are things like session timeout, 10 minutes. If you want that to be longer or shorter, you can change that. I know I need to change mine because the default is 10, and I probably want more like 30 because 10 is just not quite enough for me. But after 10 minutes, if you don't make a request, you'll end up having a session that is timed out. And so,
Oh yeah. So that's like the OAuth refresh token, client credentials. There's like a refresh flow.
the controller mesh. When I type Ziti login here, I get a session that is persisted to my CLI into that token file, and that will be valid now for 10 more minutes.
Sure.
Sometimes, I get talking and 10 minutes just isn't enough. The address. This is important because this is what will be advertised to anybody connecting. So that's why you saw ZD Edge controller listed when I went to port 1280. This needs to be available to anything that wants to contact the controller. So this should be the external DNS name if you're doing the host it yourself, or it should be anything that's resolvable. Port 1280 obviously is just our default. Enrollment, the signing certificate. This is really important. This is the certificate which will be capable of uh, producing other signing certificate requests and producing other certificates. So um, every time you enroll a piece of the puzzle of the NetFoundry or the OpenZiti overlay network, a signing request will have to be created, and this will be the signing cert that actually signs that
Oh,
CSR.
gotcha. This is your Edge issuer, CA.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah. Oh, good reminder. We're always under the Edge section and all this stuff. So
Right.
all this is
This is where
Edge
all
related.
your identities come from.
That's right. Yep. Um, duration. It's oh, that's we got. I don't know if Jeff is watching, but we got that duration minutes. Should be just duration. This is how long your identity is valid for before you have to enroll it. So this is like your grace window. If you don't get to it within 5 minutes, then your identity is the token that is created for you is no longer valid. Same is true for an edge router. When you create an edge router, you'll have a certain amount of time before you have to enroll that edge router. After you enroll it, you're fine, but by default, you get 5 minutes for both of those.
Oh, that is really short.
For me, it's sometimes short too, because 10 minutes wasn't long enough, right? Like I'll make an identity, and then somebody will
To be
send me a
clear, this is
Mattermost.
the lifespan of the single-use token, right?
That's right. Just to get it enrolled. Yes.
Okay. I
Yeah.
guess we're assuming that it's like all programmatic or something.
No, no. 5 minutes is plenty. Like, I mean, you go
You
and
can
you
do
make
anything
an
at the same
identity.
time. Yeah, yeah.
Well,
So that's why
sure.
it's
Yeah.
configurable. so you can.
That is why it's configurable. Like, for example, the NetFoundry console, I think, sets this to, is it a day or is it 7 days?
Yeah, it's like it's a lot more
It's
than
much
that.
longer than 5 minutes. Yeah.
We're assuming human
Uh,
scale, like you're gonna email this to somebody or something.
yeah, I mean, 5 minutes is enough for human scale, but even it's not fast enough for very asynchronous human scale.
Totally.
Obviously, being security software, we are very cognizant of this. So we want to set our defaults to a point that is small enough, but not obnoxious.
You gotta
5
opt
minutes
into that
5
risk.
minutes is on the edge of those 2 things, maybe.
Okay.
Now there's the web section, and this is interesting because there's a whole thing called XWeb, and Andrew, I should have had Andrew on because he would be able to explain this way better. But if anybody's interested, we can go into details with Andrew in a future Ziti TV. But basically, this is neat because it allows you to bind certain APIs to certain interfaces from within that edge controller. There are two different API. Well, actually, I'll take it back. There's more than two. Let's go. I think it's at the bottom here. I thought we had them all listed. There's at least the Fabric Management API, the Edge Client API, and the Edge Management API. There's at least those. And so what you can do in where am I?
Web.
Wedge Edge. Yeah, I'm looking for it. What,
Is
did I
there
go
two
too far?
edges?
Did I go too? Looks like there are two edges.
But there it was web just a second ago.
No, I think that this is what I think we call in the industry a bug. Unless three edges.
I saw
Oh, you know what?
web. Maybe I
Each
was
of
reading
those routers, I bet, is somehow tacking this in there. I don't know. That is
you got lost
100%.
in the file.
That is 100% a
Somewhere
bug. All right,
there
now I got to
is
find
a
web
YAML
in
key
here.
named web.
There
There
we
we
go.
go. I knew I
I'll
saw
just
it.
search for it. So yeah, nobody saw that. All right, moving on.
Well,
So
we've been tinkering with like
so you
where this
can
file comes from.
well, I mean, we break things, we fix things, right? So you can give it a random name. In this case, it's client management. And what we are doing here is we're saying, where is the actual? I think there's only the one.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around
So
what
now,
web does.
well, I'm trying to explain that right here.
Okay.
So what this one section is doing is it's binding the Fabric API, the Edge Client API, the thing that SDKs use, and the Edge Management API, the thing the ZD CLI would use. They're
Uh-huh.
all three are bound into this. How do I scroll up and then down and then miss it? Like, what am I doing? Is maybe I use my keyboard. Maybe that's the problem.
You can set little
That's
view.
the it's the
Okay.
keyboard. I don't think the scroller wheel is working.
Oh, okay.
So you are able to bind any of these endpoints to the bind point which you want them to be bound to. What I'm
Okay.
trying to say is this lets you carve the APIs out. So if you wanted to take the management API, which is very sensitive, you don't want random people on the internet hitting your management API, and you can put it behind localhost. And instead of listening on 0.0.0.1280, you could listen on 127.0.0.1 port 1350, some other port entirely, some other IP address entirely. And that
Okay.
would leave your management API or whatever API you want bound to that actual address totally on a different with a total different listener.
Okay.
So this is useful by NetFoundry. So NetFoundry, the mop itself, will take the management API and keep it entirely internal, not
Right.
expose it to anybody. You can't use the management API from anything except for the controller. And then the Edge API, the one that the SDKs all need, always will have to be public. Like by definition, that will have to be public. And the Fabric API could also be moved out and put behind the same sort of classic network protections you would for anything else, keeping it only available like on 127.0.0.1, for example. So this is a way of splitting the APIs and allowing you to hide them behind classic networking firewalls, right? Not exposing them, only having the edge exposed to the actual internet or
Okay.
network.
So there's a file system analogy here that is also called bind. coincidentally, and it lets you like um, remount a particular directory on another directory. And this is saying for the web section, we're going to configure the existing client management interface to have additional API operations available on that same server.
I wouldn't say additional. No, I would say you're permitted. There are three, as we saw, there are three main APIs: the SDK API. The SDKs would contact, I'm this identity, give me my services, that sort of stuff. There's the management API, make an identity, make a router,
Right.
make a
Yeah, they're
make a
different
whatever.
operations.
Yep, right. So three APIs with three different functionalities. Those can all be put onto the same interface, 0.0.0.112.80,
Okay.
or three separate interfaces if you so choose. So you could have three different ports for those three different APIs.
Okay, maybe this stuff is new, like the
Oh, it's
bind,
totally
the
new. Yeah,
web
it's rel
bind
like
there.
last
Is this the
last
only way to configure client management to have an interface, or is this like another way? Because I thought up above we specified
so
the interface.
this could be called potato. Doesn't care what you call it. Like, this is just
Arbitrary name.
arbitrary named, and then I believe that name is referenced down here. So you are saying bind these APIs to the bind point named
Yeah.
Edge Management.
My question is, was there not up above yet another configuration for those APIs to be bound and to listen, or is this the new and only way
Oh,
to
yeah.
configure
So
binding?
I think you're thinking of this one right here,
Which section
right?
are we in now?
This is the Edge section.
So this is
Edge,
the okay. I got you that that's not the listener. That's the advertisement.
right?
But was there another binding configuration for an interface up above, or is everything
The
now
other
on the
one, the
web?
other one's for the controller.
Okay, so
Edge controller,
those look
different.
like listeners.
Yeah.
So isn't that redundant to the web binding?
Redundant, no, because the web binding is under the Edge, and these bindings are for the controller.
Okay, so you cannot configure bindings for the controller under the web section.
Right.
Okay, those are
You
totally
configure
separate.
controller bindings here, and then you configure the bindings for the web or Edge down here
Okay, so
in
web
the
is
web
subordinate
section.
to edge.
Exactly.
I
Yep.
didn't realize that.
Yep. Or at least, if not subordinate, intimately tied to. I don't
But
know.
it looked like
Like
it was top
Andrew could
level.
answer that one.
I didn't gather that it was
No,
indented below edge.
it's not. It's not. Um,
Then that relationship is not implied by the format here. I got you.
it is not. No,
Okay.
and that's why Andrew would probably be a better one to answer that particular question, because I
Okay.
don't know that actual answer. Um, yeah, that's that. Well, geez, we're only going to get through controller config. It's 11:43 already. Um, yeah, then got other interesting config options in here, like how long do you want the idle timeout to be when you have, as it says, pipelined requests, what the read timeouts should be, write timeouts, minimum TLS, max TLS. That's nice because if you want to only support TLS 1.3, you can do that. And that's basically, that's kind of like the overview of the config file. So let's see if I can get through an edge router config. Hopefully it's not as hard.
I bet it's
So
less complex.
when we look at an edge router, same sort of things you'll see an identity section. There'll only be one identity section for an edge router. The most important piece of information I could give anybody listening is these files get produced by the active enrollment. So if that folder doesn't exist, I think enrollment fails. I don't think it makes the full entire path, but it'll drop the client server, server cert, server key, and CA cert into that actual location. And you can see, because it's a shared file system, I am putting it into one that has the ZD edge router, the name of the edge router. It'll then ask you for what the endpoint is I am to talk to. And so you see ZD controller, not ZD edge controller, and you see port 6262. That was the control port from before. Next little section you'll see is link dialers and link listeners. There are 4 main sections: link, dialer, listeners, and then just listeners and dialers. So this config has 3 of those 4, and the dialers is missing. But what I mean by that is if there were, we could also do a dialers section here. I don't remember if one of the configs has them. We'll find that out in a second. The link dialers indicates that I want to be able to dial any other links or any of the routers that are on the overlay. And the listeners is what will tell other routers where to dial. So if I don't want to be a dialer, I don't need a link dialer. If I only want to be a listener, I can just make a link listener and not have a link dialer. Make sense? And then in the link listeners section, I specify the binding as transport. What the binding is, this is the local IP and port I want to bind on, and then what my advertised this is a host name, but domain name, however another router should dial me. And because I'm lazy, I use 0.0.0.0. If you know your actual interface IP, is better, and then you can control what interface it's being bound on and whatnot. But that's what that section is all about. And then there's the edge listeners. So in the listeners section, it is more generic, meaning you can add different kinds of listeners. And the one kind that I know of, I don't know if we have others, is the edge listener. I guess there's tunnel right there too. There's 2. So the edge binding under the listeners section is what tells and what listens for edge connections. So connections from the SDKs. So that means under listeners binding options advertise, which you can see right here, it says anybody who's trying to connect to the overlay network, this edge router is called Ziti edge router. This is why in my hosts file from before, I have an entry for Ziti edge router. And this is why if you look at the Docker compose file, you'll see edge router will also expose port 3022. It has to. Otherwise, my outside ZD Desktop Edge and all my outside clients like this, they wouldn't be able to connect to that edge
That's
router.
how they contact the ZD
network. This is Docker, right? So this is where firewalls kind of come in, because like that when I do this exposing the port in Docker Compose, it's analogous to exposing that port in my firewall. Right. So if I were to go back, in fact, maybe I should do that. Let's kind of tie that into firewalls here real quick, because if I look at this file and I look at all of the ports that are in here, I don't know how I'm going to find them all. Maybe I'll just go down the arrow. But you'll see this is the controller file. Thank you, Ken. Okay. Yep. So the controller will need port 6262 open in the firewall if we want routers to be able to connect to the controller, which of course we need. So in the NetFoundry console, I think this is actually port 80 is what we use, because port 80 and 443 are almost always outbound open. It's infrequent to find a customer who won't allow port 80 and 443 outbound. Some don't. Some you have to whitelist the routers and the controller. But for a controller, you're going to need this port exposed in your firewall. That's for routers to connect. And then you'll need the edge controller, edge API address. You'll need this exposed. And as I was going through this, I'm going to ask Andrew if this is even required. It says it's required, but this is effectively the same thing as the bind points in the web section down below. So I'm going to actually ask him about that. And then you'll need whatever bind points you specify exposed. So those are the ports that you need. And in the NetFoundry console, this will be port 443 for the controller as
When you
opposed
say
to port 80.
exposed, you're implying exposed to a particular audience because you've got 3 different audiences here, maybe more.
Well, yeah, I'm only focusing on what you need for holes in your firewall to establish a secure overlay network. You need a hole in the firewall that goes to the controller for the management channel so the routers can talk to the controller.
Right.
You'll have to have that, especially if they're good. I mean, this is going to be over the open internet, right? You'll have to have a hole in the firewall for that. Then you can whitelist them if you want to whitelist them. I guess you could go that. I never even thought about that. Whitelisting only the router IP addresses for the controller. That's a good thing. We wonder if we do that in NetFoundry. And then you'll need another hole in the firewall that needs to be open to the open internet, port 443, which will let SDK clients connect to the controller. And that's all you need open to the internet from a firewall perspective. And then internal to your network, or however else you want to secure the other ports, you could then carve off these other APIs, the management API and the Fabric API, so that they're only available on localhost. This is a to do on my let's update the Express quick starts so that we actually do that, but it hasn't been. I haven't done it yet. And that's, like I said, those are analogous to looking at the router. Oh, I want the router. That's analogous to every port inside of here where I expose. So, it's wrapping. I don't want it to wrap. So here on the controller in Docker, I expose port 1280. That's important because that is the port which the SDK clients will connect on. And then I expose a port for my edge router so that my edge routers can be public to my local network. And I do 3023 for the WebSocket one. But yeah. Right. So let's go back to the edge router config here. We talked about the listeners. Oh, yeah. So now there's this edge section. This is dependent on whether you have an edge router enabled or not. If you have an edge router, you need an edge CSR section. This will be what is put into a certificate signing request and sent to the controller for signing. That's how you will create a certificate for this router. And you need to put the correct entries for the IP address and the DNS names you want that certificate valid for. In this case, the external address is Ziti Edge Router, and then I always add localhost just in case you want to make a localhost connection. We then have some transport related options and some forwarder related options, which are not well documented that I know of either. I don't even bother modifying them. The defaults always work for me. But what's important about this config file is actually the section that has the edge listeners. This is the critical section of this particular config because it says this router is an edge router. That's what it does. The other critical section is it says this router can also act in tunnel mode, and it can act as a host tunneler, which means I can use this router to provide offload traffic out of the overlay network. And that's what that means. So if I look at one of the private ones, because we also have the private red. If I look at one of the private ones, the way I end up choosing to do it is I'll put comments in front of these things so that you can clearly see what I'm doing and why. So in this case, let me refer back to the diagram, which is this. All right. Remember
What I
the red.
understood from that, Clint, was that the listener binding edge piece that you were showing in the config would flip the switch to turn on the edge router functionality. So if that was off, then you couldn't use that particular instance of ZD router to provide the on-ramp for identities, but it would still do all the other stuff with the green lines, the mesh between the links between the routers.
It all depends. So that's where I'm going, right? Here you can see this is the red private. Stop scrolling. This is the red private routers config. It only has a link dialer. It will only establish routes outbound. There's a third one that goes here, but I don't draw it because it makes it complicated. It only establishes outbound. It does not listen on the edge, like you were saying, and it does not have a edge dialer or a binder, a tunnel binder, which in retrospect is probably a problem because it means I can't use the red router to offload into the red network. Um, anyway, and then because it's not an edge router, it doesn't have an edge CSR section, but it needs a CSR section still. So it's just not an edge CSR section. And really, that's the only difference here is it's all in this link dialers, link listeners, listeners, dialers, those four sections. And that's really all it is. I don't know of any, in fact, I don't think we have any dialers like raw dialers. They're all the dialers are link dialers that I use in this config at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, the dialers is probably the piece I'm still the most fuzzy on, but the rest of it, I'm starting to see like the common terms between them.
When you say the dialers, you mean this one in particular? Because there's only one here, right? Or do you
Right.
mean the one that's missing? Because there's a hidden dialers that you could set. I don't even know what goes here. But just like there is a generic listeners section, there's also a generic dialers section. And I don't
Okay.
know what kind of generic dialers we have. Like I think proxy might be one, like transport. I don't even know. I really don't know. I don't ever use them because in my worldview, if it's not an edge router, I don't know if I want it because all the good stuff that the edge provides. Fabric has all kinds of great stuff in it, and the edge router is a superset of the fabric, at least currently, as far as I know. So I always just use edge routers because I'm lazy. But this dialer, in fact, maybe we'll look at the purple one here, the fabric router. So this little link dialer says this red router should try to establish a connection to the purple router, to this green one, and to this green one. So let's look at the Ziti fabric router. That is not okay. We can get there. There we go. Fabric YAML. Now, this fabric router here is set to be a link dialer as well as a link listener, which means this router will dial links to that green one and to this green one, as well as any other listening routers. But these two are not set up as listeners, so it won't dial to them. These are only dialers.
All right. So link dialers binding transport means that this router will try to dial using transport protocol all other edge route. Oh, sorry, all other uh, listening routers, all
Right.
other routers that have
Link
a link
link listening.
listener, right,
Yep.
which is configured right there for this router, but it's only going to try to dial them if they are listening,
Exactly.
if they're
Yep.
advertising.
That's right. Yep. And so one of the things that I could do that I didn't even think about until right now is I could only have uh, I could take the listeners, the link listeners off of these public edge routers if I wanted to, and not right now this edge router will dial this edge router, right? So if I go back to here and I do not Docker, Ziti, I'm gonna have to log in. Ziti fabric list links. That's if I enough. There it goes. All right. So you'll see I've got 9 links that get created right now from the Docker Compose file. Those 9 links are from the blue router, one to the green, one to this green, one to this purple. From the red router, one here, one here, one here. That's 6. From the purple router, one here, one here. That's 7 and 8. And then 9 is between these two green routers. So if I were to take off the green routers from being edge listeners, or sorry, link listeners, then I would stop having where is the WebSocket? This one, going to, where's the dialer? Right here, WebSocket going to Edgewater. I would not need this link.
Right. This is an inventory of all your mesh links.
That's right. Yep. And as far as the firewall goes on the routers, you need, I think I said it before, but I'll say it again. You need the advertised links, not need, but you probably need those ports open, because this will be how the other routers, which are in other locations, form that mesh. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
you either have to have a private network already, which some of our customers do. Like if you're a tier one telecom, and you have a whole entire network, you could keep everything on net by setting up your routers this way. And then let me look one more quickly time at the edge router one right here. And then you'll definitely want the listeners binding advertised port open to the world, because you'll never know where your SDK clients are going to be. So like if I go to Starbucks,
Right.
you want me to be able to connect to your edge router. That's from Starbucks.
Okay, so the alignment with the firewall needs are primarily these advertisements.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. Whew, that took a whole hour.
There's a lot in there.
I can't believe it took a whole hour. We have a chat. Oh, we have a chat from, I don't know if you already covered that. What's the difference between Edge Router and the Edge Router WebSocket? Good question. So the main difference is we have two flavors of Edge routers. One Edge router is your standard Edge router. One was developed specifically to support a product that we're working on called Browser, and it's because Browser wants to create a WebSocket instead of a standard TCP socket. So there's a special kind of, in fact, maybe I show my screen and we can look at that config real quick. Ziti Edge Router WSS. What was it called? Router WSS.yaml. SS. Pretty sure there's a special section in here. I'm trying to find. Oh, right there. Here's the very, very subtle difference. Right. So instead of listening on TLS colon 0.0.0, we are listening on WebSocket WS 0.0.0. That's the difference. I wanted to say awesome video, questions about different certs, APIs, routers. All right, cool. Well, that's going to be our Ziti TV for today. I think we covered a tremendous amount of ground. I'm going to pop this back open. We had no change logs. We talked about controller and router configurations, and we talked about firewall requirements in the midst of those things. Hopefully it was useful.
It helps to demystify those configs. There is definitely a vocabulary to acquire, but it's mostly self-evident once you spend a little time with it.
Well, just like everything, it's easy once you know it.
Of course.
All right, Ken. Well,
as
as always, fun times. We'll see you on next Ziti TV.
Later.